We have a fair amount to cover, so I thought someone was going to be here to introduce me, but that was Janice. I don't see her. I'm not sure. So if a couple of you are here, you've told me you can hear me. Thank you. And we will get started. So I'm sure more people will come in. So yes, this is a different format. It's different than Zoom. I can't see any of you, so I'm speaking to my screen, and I will watch the chat much as I can. This is Identifying Adversity. Thank you for joining me, and thanks to Southwest Behavioral Health Partnership for having me here today. So Identifying Adversity. There's Janice.
I'm sorry, I was stuck. Okay. Wouldn't let me in fast.
Okay.
Yeah, I would like to introduce you first.
Go ahead.
Okay. This is Roger Reynolds, and he is a peer leader and educator. He's part of the Southwest Behavioral Partnership Steering Committee. He has experiences and trauma that he will work with you to tell a story. So welcome, Roger. I'm excited. Can you tell?
Thanks. Yeah. Okay, good. Thanks, Janice. Thanks. And thanks to everybody who's here. So identifying adversity, it's more common than you know and harder than you think adversity is. And I want to say just a little bit, Megan's presentation that we just heard before lunch was really, really moving, really informative. And her trauma and the number of things that happened were really very difficult for her and had a very large effect on her. And she was an adult who is a therapist, and I'm guessing 3 years ago was when this started for her, was already a therapist. That means she had a master's degree in social work, therapy, or psychology, and still going through that was incredibly traumatizing for her. What I'm going to talk about today is when, as a child goes through that, possibly not her experience, but when a child lives through adversity or trauma from birth, or at 5 years old, or 6 years old, or 10 years old, or 12 years old, they don't have the knowledge, they don't have the education, they don't have the maturity that she had. And so, so I just want to kind of frame that of like, we're talking about traumatic events that happened long before the maturity and the education and the knowledge that Megan had when she went through what she lived through. So I'm just going to read the description just because I think it kind of will set the stage. So identifying adversity. When there are no bruises on the outside, when do insults become emotional abuse? When do arguments become domestic violence? Severe emotional and psychological abuse can happen with little to no physical abuse. Civilians can have PTSD. Adults can have PTSD from their adverse childhood experiences. I grew up with minimal physical abuse, yet experienced quite severe emotional, psychological neglect and abuse. I will talk about the adverse childhood experiences study and the PTSD checklist for civilians and a bit of my story. All of this is to help you learn to identify neglect and abuse when there are no bruises on the outside. So a content warning is just that we will talk about various kinds of physical abuse. They will be mentioned, but it's not the main focus, and it won't be in detail. And we will discuss various kinds of emotional neglect and abuse. Again, they're going to be mentioned more in the terms of these two questionnaires that I'm going to talk about. We're not going to go in depth, and I'm not going to go into any severe stories of my own. But just hearing these questions, it could activate recovered memories. You could realize that you were hurt, or you have hard memories that you need to that are coming up, and you'll have to deal with those, or that you have to take care of yourself, or something else could happen. We're going to go through 2 self-assessment lists. it's human, as a human, it's natural to kind of keep track for yourself as you hear these questions. You're not required to. This is just for you to listen to me and learn about this. So it's a human nature to kind of keep track when you're hearing questions, but you're not required to. There's going to be nothing asking about what your scores were or anything like that. If you do keep track, remember that your answers and your number does not change who you are. It only identifies some of what you have lived through and lived with. So different people take some of these assessments and like, oh my gosh, now I have this diagnosis. What does this mean about me? It means that it identified something that's already been happening in you and that you've already been living with. So it doesn't change who you are before you took this questionnaire. But take care of yourself. If you need to take a break or leave, feel free to do that. I'm going to go through these 2 self-assessment lists pretty fast and see if we have time for discussion at the end. The self-assessments are easy to find on the internet. So the first one is called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And so the word adversity or adverse, it's a common word, but we don't always use it. Its meaning is to cause harm or to be harmful. And another word that really fits, is very much a synonym, is traumatic or trauma. So the Adverse Childhood Experience Study was done in California in the mid-90s. It was sponsored by Kaiser Permanente, which is a California HMO, so a health insurance organization, and the CDC. And I'm going to go through the 10 questions. And I'm going to have to read because they're worded specifically, I don't have them memorized. And these questions, if you've ever taken a mental health questionnaire, the questions are trying to cover a lot in as few words as possible. And sometimes they're a little bit convoluted or a little bit confusing, but they're trying to achieve a lot in as little as possible. So I will read them. Sometimes they'll sound a little bit weird, but this isn't my wording. I'm reading these from the questions that were used for the study. So the questions are, prior to your 18th birthday, and this one is about physical abuse. The question is, prior to your 18th birthday, did a parent or other adult in your household often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? This would be physical abuse. Janice, there's a question. Are you muted? I'm hearing background noise. I don't know if you can mute yourself. Yeah, I can hear you, Janice. Do you know how to mute? I can still hear you. There, now say something. You're good. You're muted. Very good. Thank you. A second question, and I actually have these out of order from how they're usually listed, and in a minute you'll understand why. The second question, did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you, or have you touched their body in a sexual way, or attempt or actually have oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? Obviously, this covers sexual abuse. A third question, was your mother or stepmother, and this was done in the 90s, and I'm going to say parent regardless of gender. So was your parent often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at them, or sometimes or often or very often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard, or ever repeatedly hit over at least a few minutes, or threatened with a gun or a knife? That would be domestic violence. And I'm going to add to that, although that's not, these questions are short, trying to be short and succinct, but a whole lot of verbal abuse, even without physical, is still domestic violence. And the fourth question here, did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, or had no one to protect you, or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you or to take you to the doctor if you needed? This would be physical neglect. Now, I said these were out of order. The reason I did those 4 in that order is because out of these 10 questions, these are the only 4 that address physical abuse, physical contact. So part of why I call this no bruises on the outside is that's a large part of my story. But the next 6 do not involve physical abuse. So the 5th question, did a parent or other adult in your household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? I can tell you for my life, for my childhood, there was always the fear of physical harm, although it happened very little because I submitted and knew the rules. So thankfully, my father was not raging unpredictably. So if I followed his rules, tried not to upset him, then I could have very little physical abuse. The 6th question, did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were very important or special, or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? So the question I just read before would be emotional abuse. This one is emotional neglect. 7th question, were your parents ever separated or divorced? So parental separation. The 8th question, did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic or who used street drugs? So this is addressing if you had people in the house with substance abuse problems. The 9th question, was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? So this is living with someone in the house who has mental illness. Now I will identify for myself, my mother was very depressed, but never talked about it, never admitted it. So for me to identify that as a child, like I knew her behaviors, but I had no words to describe it and couldn't have told anyone else. And the 10th question is, did a household member go to prison? And I'm going to add or jail. So having a parental figure incarcerated. Those are the 10 questions that were used in the mid-90s. They're short questions. They do not nearly cover all of the possible traumas that could happen during childhood. And if you're thinking about these, one of my things was to point out that 6 of these 10 are non-physical. And also, if you're looking at these 10 questions, and you can do searches online to find the adverse childhood experience questions, and this has become a great area of study, and there's a lot more happening, and the questions are being fleshed out, the questions are being expanded. There's a lot of information out there. But when they did this question, when they did this over 2 years from 95 to 97, it was sponsored and done by an HMO, a healthcare facility. So everybody had good health care. They questioned over 17,000 people. The average age was 57. It was roughly 10% Asian, roughly 10% Black, and roughly 80% Caucasian. 74% had attended college and 46% had graduated college. That is that's far above the national average. So these were people living middle-class lives or above mostly. Out of those 17,000 plus who were questioned, who answered this, 12.5 of them had 4 or more yeses to these 10 questions. And 4 becomes a cutoff that they started to look at, because when people have 4 or more yeses to these questions, now this is, remember, it's a healthcare facility that's asking this. So they actually have the people's healthcare records. So they started to put this information together. People who had 4 or more, and I'm not even going to include the percentages just out of the consideration of time, but they were much more likely, significantly more likely, to have severe obesity, to have heart disease, to have cancer, to have a stroke, to have diabetes, or to have chronic lung disease. Now remember, this was done by a healthcare organization and the CDC. The mid-90s, mental health is not looked at as much as it is now. We're making progress to be considered equal to physical health. We're not there yet, but at least we're making progress. So the first things they looked at were physical health problems connected to that. But why in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s are these people having physical health problems from things that happened in their childhood? So if childhood trauma is having this much of an effect on lifelong physical health, imagine how much it's affecting lifelong mental health. One of the easiest things to identify here is these people are having chronic stress, and stress is causing these things. So a little bit of mental health that was taken out of this study is people also were much more likely to have depression. People had a shortened lifespan. If they had 4 or more, they had a shortened lifespan by 20 years. And there was a 700% increase in alcoholism. If there was an ACE score of 6 or above, the chance of suicide attempt was 30-fold, or a 3,000% increase in suicide attempts if you had an adverse childhood experience score of 6 or more. So we're getting into a little bit of mental health stuff. This is really serious. If you want more info, so those are the 10 questions. That's a little bit. I'm just working to introduce you to this. You can do searches on the internet and find more information. There is a fantastic YouTube video about the adverse childhood experiences study. It's 16 minutes long, and so it's abbreviated ACE. And if you go to YouTube and you do a search for ACE and Nadine, Nadine Harris, you will find her 15 or 16-minute TED Talk. So it's the ACE study and Nadine Harris. It's an amazing 16-minute, really fantastic talk. A book that doesn't talk specifically about the ACE study, but does talk about how this is affecting people, how it's affecting children, is a book called The Body Keeps the Score. So it's The Body Keeps the Score. And if you do a search for that, you will find it. The author, his last name is Vander Kolk, Vander space Kolk. So The Body Keeps the Score, Vander Kolk. I have an ACE score of between 7 to 8.5, because there are a few questions where I would put a half. And I also look at, like, although I don't literally meet what they're asking, if I look at the general topic that they're asking about, that absolutely was happening in my life. I have had mental health struggles all of my life. I think I started to think about suicide when I was 10 or 11. Well, I know that I did. And I had no one to talk to. I had no one that even understood or that I could talk to. From age 20 to 46, I saw a therapist on and off, and my diagnosis was mild chronic depression. So I haven't told you much about my childhood, but I've told you about this ACE study, and I have a score. And so now I want to go forward to another piece of my story, and a piece of a story that I think a lot of people are probably living with and may not know. And so it's jumping forward to finally, when I was 3 months before I turned 46, I was finally accurately diagnosed with PTSD as a civilian. 2 years later, and then from there, I started to work with a really good psychiatrist and a really good therapist. It took 2 more years to accurately diagnose me with generalized anxiety disorder. And they were very competent, and I was being very open. But there was domestic violence and abuse in my household before I was born. So during my literal gestation, and as soon as I was born, there was trauma happening in my life. So I didn't understand what anxiety symptoms were, and I didn't talk about them. That was just my life. And so I didn't even know to talk about some of these feelings to my psychiatrist and my therapist, because I didn't know they were symptoms. And I also, if you have an abusive family, in my abusive family, we put on a really good public front. And when you're taught to put on that public facade, this is what you present to the public. And so even though I was openly talking about things, it still took a couple years to identify another diagnosis that accurately fit what I did. So this next form, as I said, is a PTSD form for identifying PTSD in civilians. This form changed my mental health treatment plan, and that changed my life. It is still written for someone who experienced one major trauma. I have many, and as I said before, fear in my household never went to zero, and it was never, ever completely comfortable or happy in my house. As I said, domestic violence was happening in my house before I was born. I don't have a before trauma started happening. I don't have a life before something bad happened. So I don't have that reference point. So some of these questions I have to just kind of guess. And so, but it still is really helpful. So it's called, this form is called the PCL-C. It stands for PTSD checklist. So PTSD checklist -C for civilian. If you do a search for PCL-C, you will find it online, and you can find this form lots of places online. One thing to mention, and as I go through, this one includes 17 questions, but one thing to mention, and Megan mentioned this also, in assessing someone for PTSD, the trauma, the event that was traumatic for them is never evaluated. To diagnose PTSD, it is all about the person's response to that event or to those multiple events. So as I read through these questions, there's nothing assessing the severity of the trauma. It's all about your response. So the PTSD checklist, and I know I'm going through these fairly quickly. We have only 45 minutes, and so I want to get through them and see if we have any time for questions. But my goal is to just get people to even know about these and how much can happen to someone when there still are there's very little to no physical abuse. So the PTSD checklist for civilians, it opens with the statement, below is a list of problems and complaints that people sometimes have in response to stressful life experiences. Please read each one carefully. Pick the answer that indicates how much you have been bothered by that problem in the last month. And how you answer this is for each question, there's rating 1 through 5. 1 is it doesn't bother you at all. 2, it's a little bit. 3, it's moderate. 4, it's quite a bit. And 5 is extreme. And so now I'll just go through these questions. The first question is and again, these are weirded, a little bit weird. It's going to sound weird as I read them because they're trying to be as short as possible and cover as much as possible. So in the last month, have you so this first set, so if we think about PTSD, the first two things we hear about is flashbacks and nightmares. And I don't have flashbacks, and I really don't have nightmares. And so that was another piece of why it was harder to diagnose me from the beginning. But so this first set of questions are about re-experiencing the trauma. So does something happen that the person re-experiences the trauma? So the first one is, in the last month, have you had repeated disturbing memories, thoughts, or images of a stressful experience from the past? The second question is, in the last month, have you had repeated disturbing dreams of a stressful experience from the past? The third question is, in the last month, have you suddenly been acting or feeling as if a stressful experience were happening again, as if you were reliving it? 4, in the last month, have you had the feeling of being very upset when something reminded you of a stressful experience from the past? And the fifth question for re-experiencing is, in the past month, have you been having physical reactions, heart pounding, trouble breathing, or sweating when something reminded you of a stressful experience from the past? Again, you can find this online. I know I'm going through this quickly. The second set of questions are about avoidance. And this is something that in general talking, we don't hear about PTSD much. And avoidance, so in that first section, I don't score very highly. In the second section, avoidance, I score very highly. The next questions here. In the last month, have you avoided thinking about or talking about a stressful experience from the past, or avoided having feelings related to it? I can tell you, as a child, to submit to an abuser, you end up shutting down. You may end up shutting down your own feelings. So sometimes you don't even know that you don't have feelings because you've been shutting them down all your life. I wasn't accurately diagnosed until I was almost 46 years old. So I'd been doing this all of my life. The next question, in avoidance. Have you avoided activities or situations because they remind you of a stressful experience from the past? The next question, in the last month, have you had trouble remembering important parts of a stressful experience from the past? The next question, in the last month, have you had a loss of interest in things that you used to enjoy? This is another question that's kind of tricky for me because everything that I enjoy in my life has been a life lived with trauma. So it's not like there are things that I stopped doing. Anything that I do that I enjoy, I've done with a trauma-affected brain and a trauma-affected view of the world. So that one's kind of weird, and I have to think about it and be like, okay, how do I have to think? And I've talked to my therapist about more of how do I answer that one. The next question is, are you feeling distant or cut off from other people? And for me, I was like, compared to what? And then the next question is, in the last month, are you feeling emotionally numb or being unable to have loving feelings for those close to you? For myself, love was actually used as a manipulative word by my parents. When they did something abusive or inappropriate, they wouldn't say they were sorry. They would say, I love you. And that was kind of their version of I'm sorry. But I was required to say, I love you too. And that meant this incident is never to be mentioned again. So it wasn't anything to do with what love really is. So I have some mixed messages regarding love. And then the last one, in avoidance, feeling as if your future will somehow be cut short. And this was the one that I always answered no. And actually, after it was probably close to 2 years of seeing my therapist, I thought about that more. And I said, I need to ask you about this one. I said, I always answer one, but I actually don't have any thoughts about my future. I think about the next week or two, what I might be doing. I might make plans with someone to do something. I don't know when people's birthdays are, but paying rent and those kind of things. But otherwise, I don't make plans for the future. I don't think about the future. I don't think about where I will be in a year or two. I don't think about that at all. And he said, oh, Roger, you need to put a 5, not a 1, because that's a really, really serious version of what this question is about. So even living this, even talking with therapists, it takes a while for us to understand what things are getting at. And the therapist doesn't, I'm filling out this questionnaire every time that I see him. We've talked about it some, but it's like, as I worked with him over a year or two, I gained more understanding. So the last section of this is about arousal, or getting excited or activated or disturbed in an active way, or a strong feelings way. So those questions are, the first one is, do you have trouble falling or staying asleep in the last month? Do you in the last month, are you feeling irritable or having angry outbursts? And I didn't have angry outbursts because I had to shut down anger. It was never allowed for me to show anger. And I didn't really know what feeling irritable meant because I also kind of had to shut that down. And although I would know some of the feeling on the inside, I actually ended up needing to talk to therapists to understand that this is feeling irritable. And then I'm like, oh, well, I feel that a lot. Having trouble concentrating. I'm sure all of us have had something happen significant, an argument with somebody, someone cut you off in traffic, something like that. And after that happens, you'll be running it through your head a lot, trying to remember what happened, figure out what happened. What did you say? What did they do? You're upset. And that's a version of rumination. And in my childhood, which was so confusing, I was trying to figure out how to not upset my parents. Well, there was no way to not upset them, but as a child, I didn't know that. So something would happen and I would think about it for hours, days, and weeks. And into my adulthood, that same thing happened with conflict. And again, after a year or two of working with a psychiatrist, I said, okay, I need to ask you something about this because I say that I have very little trouble concentrating. But when something upsets me and I'm thinking about that for hours in a day and for days and weeks afterwards, I said, does that count as concentration? Because I'm using my brain. And he said, Roger, that's rumination. That is what would interrupt concentrating in a conversation or watching a TV show or doing homework. I'm like, oh, then I really need to change my answer on this because that rumination interrupting concentration on other things happens a lot in my life. So it's more about really getting to understand what these are asking about. And I'm telling you pieces of my story so that you understand if you're working with someone or if you're answering this yourself, there's more depth to understanding how to answer these questions of what they're getting at. There's just two more in the arousal. Are you super alert or watchful and on guard? Another word for this is hypervigilant. Like, are you always reading people? Are you always watching for something to go wrong? And absolutely I do. If I'm in a room and someone falls down or someone breaks a dish or someone clanks their plate or there's a child that's lost, I'm one of the first people to always notice if there's a problem in a room or in a group of people. And I don't even think about it. It's just happening. And the last question is feeling jumpy or easily started. And so that easily startled. So easily started or a high startle response or easily startled. And those are the 17 questions. Again, this is the PCL-C, the PTSD checklist for civilians. It's from the DSM-4, not the DSM-5. And I think it actually better addresses diagnosing civilian PTSD than the new version of the PTSD checklist that is in line with the DSM-5. So this is the one I recommend because I think it addresses for civilians better. So I said it took until I was almost 46 to accurately diagnose me. So that's the form. So why did it take so long to accurately diagnose me? The first one, I had very little physical abuse. I had no physical sexual abuse. I never used alcohol or other drugs. And I present well. I'm intelligent. My family life, it was required that when we were in public, we presented well. And so even though I went to therapist and talked openly and honestly about things that happened, I might break down and cry, or I might be upset or touched or moved by something, but it is part of my training. If you're going to go in front of people, you get yourself cleaned up, you get yourself calm and composed. And so I don't come into therapist looking disheveled, and maybe I haven't really showered for 5 or 6 days, but I shower before I go to the appointment. So I present well. I also didn't know most of my symptoms. This was my life. I never had a life before trauma was happening. So this was just my life. This was just my brain. This was just my body. I had to learn all of the things happening in me that were symptoms. And as I went through this list a little bit, you heard me explain some of how I got to understand these questions more as I learned more. I know that was fast, but we actually have a few minutes left. Again, just to say, you can do a search to find these documents on the internet. Adverse Childhood Experience, the ACE, and the World Health Organization, because this was started in the United States, we haven't had wars on our land for a long, long time. War absolutely is a traumatic event for everyone. And so the World Health Organization has recently come up with something they call the ACE-IQ. So it's ACE-IQ, and that stands for International Questionnaire. That is more complete, and it's more in depth, and it covers other areas. So you can also look for the ACE-IQ. Again, on YouTube, if you look up ACE, and Nadine Harris, you will hear a 16-minute fantastic talk about this, and you'll find other things then too from that. And the form that I recommend is the PCL-C, the PTSD checklist for civilians. Now, I don't know that we can go interactive. I'm not sure I know how to do that. But if anybody has questions or comments that they want to type in the chat part, feel free. And while you do that, I will see if I can get us actually interactive. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. My point of doing this is what happened to me was so overlooked because I didn't have physical or sexual abuse, and I didn't get into using drugs or alcohol to self-medicate. And being intelligent plays a role in my being able to adapt to my childhood and carry that forth into life. So I'm available to do public speaking as a volunteer. This was fairly quick, but I can do much more in-depth discussions and present this differently. I don't always go through these questions, but this is something I wanted people to see the tools for this. Those are the main points. We have about 6 minutes. Does anybody have a question or comment? And I'm going to simultaneously see Janice, do you know how to make other people able to talk? I don't. But Janice, do you have any question or comment?
Well, I found it. Actually, I'm impressed because past a year ago in my own personal life, I did the ACE test and I was a number 8.
Yep.
And I never knew what the trauma really was. I had a lot, I know what they are, but I didn't know exactly the term. Mm-hmm. And the PTSD, I just got diagnosed with that also. And I love the questions on these. I think everyone, if they look up these questions and answer them, they'll find out a lot about themselves. And it's a useful tool. And thank you. I appreciate you sharing your story too, Roger. It's very hard to do. And does anybody have any questions out there?
Here we go, somebody. How does knowing your ACE score affect your therapy session? How does it help your therapist? Okay, so your ACE score, in my opinion, and I'm a person with lived experience, I'm not a therapist. I think taking the ACE test and how it would help in therapy is that you would take the ACE test and now whether you're doing in person or you're doing video conference or you're doing over the phone, you can get that copy of the questionnaire and your answers to your therapist. One way that it would help them is it would let them know different subjects to work with you on. So definitely taking the ACE test would tell your therapist different subjects to help work with you on and to identify what would be. So how does knowing your ACE score affect your therapy session? So I think I've answered that, and that it helps your therapist know. And so in like 2011 or 12, I was seeing a therapist, and she said, well, from things that you talk about, it sounds like there's a little bit of trauma in your history. So, and then it turns out, even though I saw therapists on and off for 26 years, no one accurately diagnosed me because I didn't report this physical stuff, because it didn't happen, because minimal happened. And so since 6 of those 10 questions on the ACE score are non-physical, a lot of times, and even in the book that I recommended, The Body Keeps the Score, it's an excellent book with excellent information. And yet he still mentions trauma. And all over and over and over, when he mentions traumatic things happening to people or happening to children, he says trauma, physical or sexual, also emotional or psychological. And they need to be put all together, because this presentation that physical and sexual, and I'm not trying to compare them, but they get compared already. And how a person is affected is the most important thing. But the fact that someone didn't have very much or little physical trauma or sexual trauma, 6 of those 10 questions don't involve physical stuff. And that's what part of my message is. And that's what answering those questions will help your therapist and help you talk through it with your therapist and be like, oh, here are some other subjects to look at. I hope that makes sense and answers that question. Other questions? Other thoughts? Thanks, Janice, for your comments. And thanks, Wendy. Thanks, Wendy. You said that was a good answer. Thank you. I'm glad it was helpful. And anything else? I can tell you, so I'll just try to fill in here. I didn't think about what to fill in. I didn't know I would get done earlier than we did, and which I'm glad I got through it all. That's why I went fairly quickly. It's changed my life, and getting the accurate diagnosis of PTSD. And one of the biggest things was getting the validation that this stuff was harmful, that these actions were harmful, that these actions affected my life and my behaviors. The Body Keeps the Score, that book, which I highly recommend. It will change how you see people. That book is actually the author's attempt to get an additional diagnosis added to the DSM. And the diagnosis he's trying to get added is, now I can't remember because I haven't read it for a while, but it is about childhood trauma. And that, so the stuff that Megan talked about, when I don't know how old she was, but she was already through school and had 3 children. So we'll assume that she's close to 30, if not 30, or maybe more. When these things are happening as a child, they affect your brain. And she talked about trauma brain. And when it happens as a child, your brain is still developing. That's what he calls it. He calls it developmental trauma disorder. In the book, The Body Keeps the Score, developmental trauma disorder. Because not only is the trauma affecting your brain, it's also affecting your brain development. And after reading that book, and I'd probably been seeing my primary therapist for about 4 years, and he had read the book also, and we talked about it. And I said, so do I have a non-physically caused traumatic brain injury? And I'll say that again. I said to him, do I have a non-physically caused traumatic brain injury? And he said, yes, you do. We're out of time. I'll leave it there. That's why I think it's important for people to learn about this, talk about it, and help people realize their struggles are, there's reasons for their struggles. Thank you all.
Really, thank you all, and thank you, Roger.